I grew up in a speck of a town called Medicine Bow, Wyoming. Our claim to fame is mostly that Dippy the dinosaur used to be buried here before his bones got shipped off to the Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh. We've got some hot springs outside of town. Butch Cassidy robbed a train a couple miles away back in the day. And beyond that, it's dirt, scrub, a few trees, and a scattering of trailers. My mom raised me alone. She was never big on rules or discipline, except for one. I was never, under any circumstances, to go near the place where old Bob Barnes lived. Bob's trailer sat out on the edge of town. He made a living combing through other people's trash at night, salvaging things to sell or repurpose. Everyone knew he did it. Half the time when folks caught him, they were too scared to say a word, because Bob Barnes was the man who had supposedly killed someone and walked away free. Mom called him a monster. She said the boy he killed had been a close friend of hers in high school. That was all she'd ever say, and I figured it just hurt too much to talk about. Over the years, I picked up scraps of gossip about Bob's life and the killing he was supposed to have gotten away with. I heard he'd fought in Vietnam, volunteered, even, and that when he came back, he never really came all the way home in his head. He dragged his trailer out near East Allen Lake and pretty much kept to himself. Older folks would joke, half serious, that you didn't go walking around the north side of that lake at night or you might catch a .22 meant for a squirrel. Don't want him mistaking you for supper now, do we? They'd say, with that look that told you they weren't entirely kidding. People acted afraid of him, but some also seemed to pity him a little. I remember riding in the car with a buddy and his mom when we were about 14. He started talking about old Bob like he was the boogeyman. His mom just shook her head and said, "That poor man. All he wants is to be left alone." My buddy snapped back, "Mom, he killed someone." She changed in an instant like she'd put on a mask. "He did," she said sharply, "and you better stay the heck away from his trailer, young man." It felt like we'd caught her out in something, but I couldn't have said what. Not then. By 17, Bob Barnes might as well have been the devil to me. One night I came home to find my mom drunk and teary, flipping through old high school photos, her friends, and the boy Bob supposedly murdered. Mom wasn't an alcoholic, but she liked a few wine coolers on a Friday night while Dallas or Falcon Crest played in the background. That night she'd gone farther than usual. She started talking about her dead friend, how they'd hung out together at school and sometimes after, because two of their friends were dating, how he partied a bit too hard, but he was a basically good guy and didn't deserve to die young and violent. She told me what happened the night he was killed. He and some buddies were drinking out near the lake. He wandered off into the bushes to take a leak. That's when he saw a man walking through the shrubs with what looked like a small child slung over his shoulder. Mom's friend yelled at the guy. Instead of answering, the man ran. So he and his buddies gave chase. When they caught up, Mom's friend in the lead, the man dropped the child, spun around, and shot Mom's friend dead. "Bang, bang, bang, bang," she said, snapping her fingers like she could still hear it. He was gone before he hit the dirt. The child they'd rescued was rushed to the hospital, but she died anyway. Massive dose of tranquilizers had already wrecked her organs. Every kid who'd been out by the lake that night swore it was old Bob Barnes who'd fired the shots. Yet somehow Bob was never arrested, never spent a single night in jail. After that, I understood perfectly why people hated and feared him. Why my mom did. Maybe my buddy's mom just didn't know the whole story, I told myself. But I did. And the more I thought about it, the more it festered. One of my friends later asked his dad about the little girl who died of the overdose. His dad confirmed it was true. People just didn't like talking about it because you never knew when the girl's mother might be right behind you in the grocery store. The only detail that didn't match Mom's story was that, according to him, the girl had showed up in town, not been found out by the lake. That difference didn't matter to me. The bones of the story were the same. A kid was dead, my mom's friend was dead, and old Bob had supposedly walked away clean. Someone had to make him pay. I told my friends everything. They knew how much I blamed Bob for the wreck he'd made of my mom's heart. We were sitting around a campfire one night when I stopped just talking and started planning. My bright idea. I'd hike out to his trailer in the middle of the night, watch the place to make sure it was dark and still, then set the trailer on fire. In my head, I'd light it up and run. Bob would wake, stumble out furious but alive, and be forced to move somewhere far away. That was as far as my thinking went. I know how stupid that sounds. I could have killed him, but I was 17 and angry and dumb. It took me a while to work up the nerve and get what I needed. I didn't have money for gas, so I stole a can of paint thinner from the school art room and hid it in my backpack. One Friday, after another night around the campfire with my buddies, I told them I was heading home and set off, straight for Bob Barnes' place. It took about an hour to walk around the lake to the far side. When I was maybe half a mile out, I killed my flashlight and followed the water's edge, using the shoreline and the faint glow ahead as my guide. Eventually, I could see a dim light in Bob's trailer and hear the murmur of a TV. I lay low in the dark and watched for 45 minutes until the TV went quiet and the trailer's light blinked out. I waited another minute or two, listening to the silence, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I pulled the paint thinner out of my pack and crept toward the trailer. By the time I got within a few feet of the metal siding, the stillness convinced me I'd pulled it off. No barking, no movement, no voice. Just my breathing and the dry whisper of my shoes in the dirt. I was just about to pop the lid off the can when I heard a loud, unmistakable click to my right, the sound of a gun being cocked. "What you got there, boy?" a voice growled. I froze. It was Bob. He'd caught me red-handed. I was scared that if he knew what I planned, he'd blow my brains out without a second thought, so I didn't answer. "Drop it," he said. I let the can fall. A weak beam from a small flashlight swept over it. There was a pause as he realized exactly what I'd been about to do. "Turn around," he said. "Want to see your face before I kill you." I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't listen. He rushed me, grabbed my shoulder, and spun me around. I stumbled backward and fell. He stared down at me for a long second, then lowered the gun and shoved me away as if he suddenly didn't know what to do with me. I wanted to beg, but terror had locked my throat. I couldn't make a sound. Then he said my name. The fear didn't go away, but confusion crashed into it. He knew who I was. He knew who my mom was. When I managed to nod and croak out a yes, he just sighed. "I wondered how long it'd be before you showed up," he said. The first words I got out were, "How do you know me?" "Come inside," he told me. "I'll tell you everything." I followed him into the trailer. We sat down at his little table. He set the gun where he could still reach it and asked, calm as you like, "What'd your mother tell you about me?" Maybe it was the adrenaline, but suddenly I wasn't as scared of him as I was angry. I told him about my mom's friend, about how I'd grown up hating him for what he'd done to her and that boy. He asked me to tell it from the beginning, every detail I'd heard. He listened without interrupting, a faint, strange smile on his face. When I finished, he nodded once. "Okay, kid," he said. "Here's what really happened. According to Bob, my mom's friend had been trouble since he was small. People tried to help him, but he only got darker as he hit his teens. He was expelled for stealing underwear out of the girls' locker room. He got picked up by the cops for allegedly flashing a bunch of middle school girls and only skated by on a lesser charge because he claimed he'd just been urinating. In the months before his death, he'd been seen hanging around kids all over town. When parents confronted him, he brushed it off, just playing. On the night he died, it wasn't Bob walking through the brush by the lake with a kid over his shoulder. It was Mom's friend. Bob said he'd been out hunting squirrels, like he often did at night, when he heard teenagers whooping and laughing along the lakeshore. Under the full moon, he could see them as clearly as day. He followed to make sure they weren't heading toward his trailer. As he trailed them through the shrubs, he saw that one of them had something slung over his shoulder. At first he thought it was a sack, but then he saw hair, long, glossy, catching the moonlight. It was a child. He eased closer and heard them talking, planning to do something unspeakable to the unconscious kid. That was it for him. Bob snapped on his flashlight and shouted at them to drop the child. The one carrying her, my mom's old friend, spun around. Instead of dropping the kid and bolting, he pulled a knife and started to bring it down toward her chest. Bob put a couple of .22 rounds through his chest and dropped him where he stood. The other kids scattered. Bob said he never got a clear look at their faces, only that one of them was probably a girl. They vanished into the night. He picked up the unconscious child and carried her all the way into town, straight to the old gas station. He handed her to the night clerk, told him there was a body out by the lake, and that the police ought to stop by the place of one Robert Barnes because he was the one who'd put it there. Then he left. The cops came for him the next morning. They took him in, questioned him, checked his story. The missing girl's parents were too relieved to get her back alive to feel anything but gratitude. To them, Bob was a hero. Bob didn't feel like one. He told me that when he came home from Vietnam, he swore he would never again hurt another human being. That was half the reason he pushed his life out into the sticks, to keep the world at arm's length. Killing my mom's friend tore that promise apart. If the girl had lived, maybe it would have felt worth it. But she was probably already dying from the tranquilizers in her system when he first saw her. All shooting that boy did, he said, was spare a sick man from ever having to answer for what he'd done, and let the rest of them get away scot-free. What made him sickest was knowing those kids had grown up and moved on among us. He didn't know exactly who they were, but he figured there was a pretty good chance my mom was one of them. It was why he didn't come into town. He couldn't stand to see the grown versions of the little monsters who'd helped ruin that girl's life. Then he looked at me and said, "Believe me or don't, I'm past caring, but I want you to do one thing for me. Go home. Tell your mother everything I just told you. Then look her straight in the eye and ask her if it's true." So I did. I won't lay out that conversation blow by blow. I'll just say this: our relationship never recovered. What I learned that night is the reason I haven't been back to Wyoming in almost 20 years. Back in 2002, my boyfriend and I were driving from Chicago to Vermilion, South Dakota, to visit his parents. Around noon, we were somewhere in Iowa, cutting through an endless tunnel of corn. Then, without warning, the world changed. The corn just stopped. It felt like driving out of a forest into a burned clearing. Everything to either side of the highway was gray and black, charcoal stalks, scorched soil, some kind of massive burn. My boyfriend said it was normal, just farmers clearing fields, but it still looked like the end of the world, where minutes before we could only see a few feet past the roadside. Suddenly, we could see for miles in every direction. That's the only reason I noticed them. A man and a little boy walking hand in hand across a blackened field. At first, they were just tiny figures in the distance, but even then something about them looked sweet. Grandfather and grandson on a Sunday stroll, taking in the strange sight of the burned fields. As we rolled closer, I saw they were heading toward an old stone well. I didn't say anything to my boyfriend. We were in a comfortable silence, music low, him focused on the road. I just watched the scene draw nearer, like a picture slowly zooming in. By the time they reached the well, we were close enough for real detail. The man wore worn dungarees. His hair was dark, thin on top. The boy had on a blue shirt and white sneakers, and his curly hair was almost white blonde. As we passed, I saw it clearly. The old man lifted the child in both hands, swung him out over the opening, and dropped him down the well. I screamed, "Oh my God!" My boyfriend jerked, hands tight on the wheel. What happened?" he shouted, panicking. I was already digging through my bag, looking for my phone with clumsy fingers. For a second, I almost told him to stop the car. Then I pictured us out there in that empty, burned field, an old man with a gun standing over our bodies. I swallowed it down. "Keep driving," I said. "A man just threw a kid down a well." What are you talking about?" He'd been staring straight ahead, zoned out. He hadn't seen a thing. As we sped along, I explained exactly what I'd watched. The field, the well, the way the man had picked the boy up and tossed him like a sack. My boyfriend asked if I was sure I hadn't seen something. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything. I finally dragged my phone out of my bag and flipped it open. No service, not a single bar. So I grabbed the road map instead. The nearest town was only a few miles up. I told him to floor it so we could get there and call 911. We pulled off at the first place we saw, a little roadside diner called Albert Kitchen. I practically fell out of the car and ran inside. Every head turned. I rushed to the counter and begged to use their phone. The woman behind it slid the handset toward me with wide eyes. I dialed 911, asked for the police, and told the dispatcher what I'd seen. A man had just thrown a child down a well in a burned-out cornfield off the highway. Conversations in the diner died mid-sentence as everyone listened in. When I said the words, "threw a kid down a well," people actually gasped. The dispatcher told me to stay put. A deputy would come talk to me. I thanked her, hung up, and set the phone down with shaking hands. When I turned around, every person in that diner was staring. The woman at the counter brought me a glass of ice water. My boyfriend joined me, and as we sat waiting for the deputy, a man from one of the booths came over and introduced himself. He started asking about what we'd seen on the drive, how far the burned fields went, what direction, things like that. When I told him field after field had been scorched black, he turned and asked another diner if those were Art Landry's fields. The name Art stuck with me. Landry, I think he said. Then he asked me to describe the man I'd seen. I did, and people started glancing at each other. They all seemed to come to the same conclusion. I just described Art Landry, a local farmer. Someone mentioned that his grandkids were staying with him that week while their parents were away. They were clearly rattled but more confused than anything. They knew this man. To them, he was a neighbor, a friend. The idea that he'd done something that monstrous didn't seem to compute. "Are you sure?" they kept asking. "You're absolutely positive," I told them I was. After what felt like forever, a deputy arrived. We stepped outside to talk beside our car, away from the growing crowd at the windows. I told the story again. Got the same slow, skeptical nods. It was like I'd told them I'd seen a spaceship land. While I was answering more questions, another car rolled into the lot. The county sheriff. He'd driven over from headquarters to hear this himself. The deputy spared me a fourth retelling by briefing him. The sheriff listened, then did the same drawn-out, "Huh, really?" routine. He walked away to talk on his radio, then came back a few minutes later. He said someone at HQ had already called Mr. Landry to ask about my report. Art claimed he hadn't been anywhere near the burned fields with his grandson. By then I was practically begging. "Just let me show you the well. Take me back down the highway. I can point right to it." He shook his head. He couldn't just walk onto private property without permission or a warrant. He needed to talk to Mr. Landry in person before he could do anything like that. I tried to stay calm, but every minute we stood there talking, my brain was screaming that some kid was at the bottom of that shaft, drowning or broken or both. If there was water, he could be face down in it. If it was dry, he could be bleeding out in the dark. I tried to explain all of that, step by step. The urgency, the odds, the fact that even 10 minutes might make the difference between life and death. The more agitated I got, the more the sheriff and his deputy looked at me like I might be unhinged. Finally, after I flat out begged, the sheriff told his deputy to drive out to the well and check it. The relief hit me so hard I almost cried. We waited. My boyfriend tried to soothe me, saying things like, "You'll see, it'll be okay, they'll find him." The sheriff leaned against his car, talking quietly on his radio. Then he walked back over. "Good news," he called. "The well's empty, and Mr. Landry's on his way here with his grandson, so you can see everything's all right." I just stared at him. Empty. I knew what I'd seen. I asked how the deputy could be so sure. Had he gone down there? Used a rope? Was it full of water? Could the kid be under the surface, out of sight of a flashlight? He just repeated that the well was empty and that I must have been mistaken. "Probably," he said. "The man I'd seen was just holding the kid up to look inside." Maybe from where I was, at highway speed with smoke and heat haze, it had looked like a drop. Optical illusion, he said. Trick of the light. The more he used those phrases, the more my skin crawled. I wasn't about to accept oops, never mind, when a child's life might be on the line. I didn't care if everyone in that town thought Art Landry walked on water. I knew what I'd seen, an old man throwing a blonde boy into a well. The deputy rolled back into the lot. Another vehicle followed close behind, a battered old truck. A big man in dungarees with thinning dark hair climbed out, fury written all over his face. "Now who's out here saying I threw my grandson down a damn well?" he barked. The sheriff stepped in front of him, hands raised. "Art, calm down. She was just trying to help." Art stomped around to the passenger side of his truck, yanked the door open, and helped a boy down from the seat. He marched the kid over to us. "This," he said, "is the boy she claims I dropped down a well." My boyfriend leaned close and whispered, "Gentle, see, I told you it'd be fine." But it wasn't fine. The boy I'd seen in that field had pale, curly blonde hair. The child in front of me had close-cropped dark hair. Different build, different face. I said as much. The deputy immediately jumped in. Maybe, he suggested, the sun on the kid's hair had made it look really light. Maybe the distance had confused me. The gaslighting was almost physical. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked if there was anyone else I could talk to. Anyone who would treat this like something more than a ridiculous misunderstanding. While I argued my case, the sheriff pulled my boyfriend aside. They talked for a few minutes. My boyfriend came back looking awkward. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Now," he said. The sheriff had asked him point blank if I was crazy. When my boyfriend said no, the sheriff told him we needed to get out of town or he'd arrest me for causing a public disturbance. They couldn't have strangers rolling in, flinging accusations at a good man. By then, frankly, I wanted to be gone too. Something felt very wrong in that town, and we weren't going to uncover it in a diner parking lot ringed with cops. I forced an apology to the farmer and his grandson, whoever that boy actually was. Then we got in the car and left. As soon as my phone showed a bar or two of service, I called the Iowa State Patrol. I told them what I'd seen, what I'd reported, how the local sheriff had handled it, and that I was worried something bad was being covered up on that farm. They got back to me later and said there was nothing there, nothing to pursue. I filed a formal complaint, insisting I didn't think my report had been taken seriously. The answer was the same. They'd done everything they could, there was nothing to it. But I know what I saw. I've never hallucinated before or since. I don't need glasses, and no, I'm not crazy. My dad worked for the Foreign Office and met my mom while he was posted to Peru. Her Peruvian roots meant the world to her, so I grew up on her cooking and music, listening to stories about the country we rarely visited. We only went once when I was a kid. In my late 20s, I decided it was time to go back on my own, see more of Peru, visit relatives properly, explore my mother country as she always called it. One day I was driving some tiny back road in the middle of nowhere, trying to find the little town my family lived in. No GPS, just a map in bad Spanish. Suddenly, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. Peruvian police. Not wanting any trouble, I pulled over immediately and rolled down my window, rehearsing rusty phrases in my head. I expected the usual slow approach you see in American films. Sunglasses, swagger, that sort of thing. Instead, the officer flung his door open and took cover behind it in a firing stance. He raised his pistol and started shouting at me through his loudspeaker, ordering me to stick my hands out the window. I'd barely seen guns in person before, let alone had one pointed at my face. I was absolutely terrified. I yelled that I was unarmed, that I was English, that I didn't understand. He snapped at me to shut my mouth and kept advancing, gun level with my head, trying to cuff me one-handed. One twitch and he could have put a bullet through my skull. More police cars screamed up. They dragged me out of the vehicle and hauled me off to jail. Sitting in that cell was the lowest I've ever felt. The officers were tossing around words like murderer, violator, hurting children. One cop actually gasped, "That's him," when they brought me through. I had these vivid waking nightmares of spending the rest of my life rotting in a foreign prison for something I didn't do. Every time I tried to tell them I was British, just there on holiday, they either laughed or told me to shut up, or they'd shut me up themselves. It went on for hours. I honestly thought my life was over. Then, out of nowhere, someone unlocked the cell door, told me there'd been a mistake, and said I was free to go. Walking out into the station lobby was surreal. I was still shaking like a leaf, but some officers were chuckling about the mix-up, while others muttered half-hearted, embarrassed apologies, as if they'd written me the wrong parking ticket, not held me at gunpoint and thrown me in a cell. I swallowed my anger. I wasn't about to give them any reason to change their minds. I just wanted out. Before they let me leave, they showed me a photograph of the man they'd mistaken me for, a violent criminal wanted for terrible offenses. Looking at him was like looking at an evil version of myself. The resemblance was uncanny. Later, when I reached my relatives, I asked if I had any chance of getting compensation. They laughed and said, "Not a chance." I still had an amazing time overall, and I don't regret going, but I haven't set foot in Peru since. If I ever do go back, I'll have my family meet me right at the bloody airport. The worst day of my life was a Sunday in a little coastal town called Windsor, down in North Carolina. Back then, Windsor had fewer than 2,000 residents. It was as typical a backwoods Carolina town as you can imagine. We had a grocery store, a gas station, a Bojangles, the peanut factory, and a ring of churches and chapels. That was about it. It was quiet. People knew their neighbors. Murder was a word you heard on the TV or radio, not something you expected to deal with at work. Then came the night in 1993 when that sort of evil stepped off the television and walked into town. It was the evening of June 6th. I was at the Bertie County Sheriff's Office, about a mile south of town, sitting at my desk. The county jail sits right there too. I just picked up some paperwork from another deputy and was filling it out when dispatch crackled over the radio. Sundays were usually dead slow. At most, we expected a domestic dispute or a fender bender. So when we heard the codes for man with a gun and multiple deaths, there was this frozen half-second where I thought someone had misread something. Then I saw my fellow deputies jump up and sprint for their cars. I ran after them, climbed into my cruiser, and we tore off in a loose convoy toward the grocery store on the north side of town. The place was called Below, a pun on below, as in our prices be low. It was as important to the social life of Windsor as any church. People ran into neighbors, lingered in the aisles, and chatted at the tills. Driving there, I knew the odds were high that whoever lay dead inside those walls would be people I knew, maybe friends. The store was closed by the time we got there. Sunday hours meant they shut up at 6 p.m. and the doors were locked. We still had almost no idea what had happened. The 911 call had come from a wounded survivor who was in too much pain to say much beyond. "There's a man with a gun, and people are dead." Below had big glass windows all across the front. As we approached, our headlights lit up a long trail of blood smeared from the back of the store toward the registers. We smashed the glass and went in, clearing aisle by aisle, guns raised, expecting someone to jump out at us. Near the front, we found the owner of that blood trail, a member of the cleaning crew, barely conscious, clinging to the foam. At the back, we found 5 more victims. 3 were dead. 1 was badly wounded, covered in stab wounds. The last was physically unharmed but bound and splattered with other people's blood. We did what we could medically, and the paramedics who arrived after us managed to keep both the wounded men alive. As EMTs worked and helicopters were called to airlift them out, the unharmed cleaner, the one with everyone's blood on his clothes, told us what had happened. Every Sunday, a cleaning crew came through Below after closing to wax the floors so they'd shine for the week ahead. That night was no different. At 6 o'clock, the manager saw the last customers out, locked the doors, and let the cleaning crew in. They were moving mats and plugging in buffers when the last clerk saw a stranger step out from between the aisles. She assumed he was a customer who hadn't realized they were closed. She walked over and told him as much. He pulled a gun and pointed it at her face. She tried to stay calm and told the kids to do exactly as he said. The cleaners were at the front, focused on their equipment. They had no idea anything had gone wrong. The gunman forced the clerk into the back office where the manager was doing the evening's books. Once he had them both inside, he ordered the manager to hand over all the cash on site. He'd picked his moment well. End of the week, all the receipts bundled up. He left with several $1,000s in cash and about $3,000 in money orders. He could have just walked out the door. Instead, he herded the manager and clerk back onto the shop floor at gunpoint, rounded up the cleaning crew, and marched all 6 of them to the back of the store. He grabbed dog leashes off a display and made them tie one another up, then tied the last person himself. The survivor told us that once they were all bound, he thought it was over. The man had his money. They were restrained. Maybe he'd just walk away and they'd live through a robbery, but that wasn't what he had in mind. The gunman told them to lie down in pairs, one on top of the other, stacking bodies like cordwood. No one knew why. Then he said, "God forgive me for what I'm about to do," and started shooting into the stacks. He only managed a few shots before his gun either jammed or ran dry. He ran off down the aisle. The survivors thought they might actually live. Then he came back. This time he was holding a knife he'd grabbed from somewhere in the store. He walked over to the pile that contained our survivor and his brother. He asked the man on the bottom if he'd identify him to police. The survivor said no. The man lying on top, his brother, also said no. Instead of believing them, the attacker snapped and started stabbing the brother. He slashed his throat from ear to ear, then kept stabbing him in the back until the knife snapped and the blade stayed buried in him. Then the gunman turned to the survivor and asked a second time if he'd talk to the cops. The survivor swore again that he wouldn't. The gunman stood there a moment, then walked out of the store with the money, leaving him pinned under his dying brother. Our survivor told us he was sure the killer would come back yet again. He could barely move with the weight on him, and thought he might bleed to death right there. Eventually, the other surviving member of the cleaning crew, who had been left physically unharmed but tied up, managed to work himself free, realized his coworker was still alive under his brother's body, and crawled toward the front of the store with his hands bound, leaving that long smear of blood behind him as he dragged the phone with him. That was the man we'd found. I don't think I've ever cared so much about an investigation as I did that one. One of the dead was related to the county sheriff, and he swore he wouldn't rest until the killer was caught. We all took it personally. Everything that could go wrong did. First, the B-Low security cameras had been out of order. A repairman was scheduled for that week. That timing still makes my stomach turn. No footage, no images to circulate. Second, all 3 survivors gave us the same very distinct description. White male, crooked nose, hazel eyes. Our sketch artist drew a composite that went out to agencies all over. Not a single solid lead came back. We got a report of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding out of town on Highway 17 around the time of the murder. But when we tracked down the owner, he had a rock-solid alibi. Wrong place, wrong time. One detail ended up dominating the investigation, more than I think it should have. At some point, one of the victims asked the killer, "Why are you doing this?" She meant the stacking, the tying, but he took it as a more general question. He told her he'd been a cop, that he'd recently been fired. We sent his fingerprints through every law enforcement and military database we could. No match. But the lead investigators stuck to the idea that he was ex-law enforcement or ex-military. They thought his movements, his planning, the way he cleared the store showed training. To me, it didn't add up. If he'd been a cop, we'd have found his prints on something somewhere. I started to believe he was a fugitive, maybe wanted on some other charges, who chose murder because he couldn't risk witnesses. By the time that theory gained any traction officially, He could have been halfway around the world with the money he stole. We never found him. Afterwards, a lot of people in the business spoke about the murders like they were a freak of nature. A tornado that dropped out of a clear blue sky. An awful, random disaster no one could have prevented. I never felt that way. The worst thing to happen in Windsor in maybe 2 centuries unfolded while I was 10 minutes down the road, pen in hand, doing paperwork. I still wake up sometimes thinking about that. The question that haunts me most is why he let that last man live. The survivor told us the killer looked him in the eye and said, "I'm going to let you live." That doesn't fit with the idea of some desperate fugitive eliminating witnesses. Part of me thinks he simply couldn't stand to stab someone else up close after butchering what he thought were 4 people. Maybe the reality of it finally hit him. Another, darker part of me thinks he left a witness on purpose, to talk, to spread the story of what he'd done, so he could hear about it on the news later, read about it in the papers, and feed off it. I try not to dwell on that possibility, because when I do, not catching him feels even worse. I grew up in Bart Township in rural Pennsylvania near a place called Nickel Mines. It's Amish country, real Amish, old order. The kind of people who still call anyone who isn't Amish English, who don't mess with flip phones or Roomspringa or any of that modernized Amish stuff you hear about. To us, those more liberal groups might as well have been from Mars. I didn't know any different growing up. I thought our way was the whole world. I left school after 8th grade, like most Amish kids, to work on the farm with my dad. My little brother was still in the one-room schoolhouse. I was content. Then came October 2nd, 2006. That morning, Dad and I were out working when he suddenly stopped, squinting toward the railroad tracks that ran past our property. "Is that your brother?" he asked. I followed his gaze and saw a tiny figure running full speed down the tracks toward the house. I recognized his shape right away. Dad frowned. What the hell's he doing out of school? It was only about 11 o'clock a.m. We dropped everything and headed for the house. Inside, we found my little brother sobbing in my mother's arms. Dad was ready to tear into him for skipping class. He was already working up the lecture when my brother managed to choke out why he'd run. "There's a man in our classroom," he said, "and he has a gun." Believe it or not, that wasn't even the worst part. As Dad's face darkened and he lunged for his own gun, my brother added in a small, terrified voice that the man had brought chains and hooks too. That was it. Dad saw red. He told me to stay and look after Mom and my brother, then ran out toward the schoolhouse. We didn't see him again for hours. When he came back, he was a different man. He sat us down and told us what had happened, as he pieced it together from the people who'd been there. Around 10:30 that morning, just after recess, a pickup truck pulled up in front of the school. A man walked in and asked the teacher if she'd seen a clevis pin on the road outside. A clevis pin is a little metal fastener used on farm equipment. Everyone around Nickel Mines knows what one is. She said she hadn't seen one, apologized, and wished him luck finding it. She thought he was just another farmer who'd lost a part on the way by. She did notice that he wouldn't meet her eyes and mumbled his reply, but he left. She turned back to her class. A minute later, he came back in with a pistol and told everyone that if they didn't do exactly as he said, they'd die. Thinking it was a robbery of some sort, the teacher told the children to cooperate. Instead of asking for money, the man ordered all the boys, including my brother, to go out to his truck and help carry things inside. They brought in boards, tools, a shotgun, a stun gun, coils of wire, heavy chains, and metal eye hooks. The man was planning to turn that classroom into a torture chamber while the children watched him prepare. While he was distracted supervising the unloading, the teacher slipped out and ran to a nearby farm to call 911. The man saw her go. He knew the police were on their way. He sent one of the boys after her with orders to bring her back, then started nailing boards and lumber across the schoolhouse doors, barricading them from the inside. When he finished, he let 3 adults, including a pregnant woman, and all the boys leave. Then he ordered the girls to line up in front of the chalkboard, shoulder to shoulder, like he was preparing a firing squad. The first trooper arrived within minutes, parked outside, and used his loudspeaker to plead with the man. He begged him to put down his weapons and release the children. Around the same time, the gunman called 911 himself. He told the dispatcher that if the police advanced, he'd start shooting the girls. He said all of this aloud in front of them. Those little girls listened as he calmly explained how and when he would kill them. They begged him not to. 2 of them even asked to be shot first, hoping, maybe, to spare the others somehow. He told them to be quiet and kept talking to the negotiators. By 11 o'clock a.m., a crowd of Amish and English alike had gathered beyond the schoolyard, kept back by troopers. Ambulances were lined up, engines idling, waiting for wounded. When the shooting started, my dad said, the sound that came out of that crowd was like nothing he'd ever heard. Men and women crying out all at once, this terrible wail that rose with each crack of a gunshot. As officers rushed the building, the gunman moved to a window and started firing at them with both his pistol and the shotgun. The troopers shot back, aiming only for the window to avoid hitting the children. Then his firing stopped. They thought he might be reloading or down. They forced their way inside. He was on the floor with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Around him lay the girls, aged 6 to 13, each riddled with shotgun or pistol wounds. The wounded were rushed to hospitals by ambulance and helicopter. 10 girls had been shot. 2 died right there in the schoolhouse. Others died later. Only 5 survived. Dad said one little girl passed away in the arms of a state trooper who was trying to comfort her. Later we heard that just before he opened fire, the gunman had tried to call his wife to say goodbye. She missed the call. When she got home, she found a note on the table explaining his plan. She called 911 to try to stop him, but by that point he was already barricaded in with the children. Investigators pieced together his motives from that note and a voicemail he'd left for his wife. When they released his name, the shock hit even harder. It was Charlie Roberts from down in Georgetown, the milk tank driver who'd come to our farm, and many others, multiple times a week. He knew the families of some of the girls he killed. He had a wife and 3 children of his own. His coworkers said he'd struggled with depression, but that in the week before the shootings he'd seemed oddly cheerful, like someone who'd made up his mind about something. The police thought he'd been influenced by a recent hostage situation in Colorado with some similar elements, but we'll never really know. What we do know came from his own words. In his note and voicemail, Charlie Roberts said that as a 12-year-old he'd abused 2 young female relatives. He claimed that lately he'd been fantasizing about doing something like that again. That explained the bottle of lubrication police found at the school. He also wrote about the death of his infant daughter 10 years earlier. She died during childbirth. He said the loss had filled him with hatred for himself and for God, and that the desire for revenge had festered all that time. The 2 relatives he named publicly denied any abuse, but I could understand them wanting privacy. People argued that he must have made that part up because he never actually touched the Amish girls in that way. He only executed them and then killed himself. The schoolhouse was torn down within days. They flattened the site so it wouldn't stand there as a permanent reminder. What followed among the Amish both made me proud and pushed me away. The community immediately reached out to Charlie's parents. The man's father was shattered by what his son had done. Amish elders visited his home and told him they forgave Charlie. They said it wasn't his fault. Many Amish men and women attended Charlie's funeral out of sympathy for his wife and children. That part moved me. His parents and wife had done nothing to deserve the hell he dropped on them. What I couldn't get my head around was how quickly people forgave Charlie himself. We're taught not to hold grudges. We're taught that judgment belongs to God alone. Some people said they were glad he'd taken his own life because it meant God had judged him right away. I even heard someone say that if he'd repented in those last moments before pulling the trigger, all his sins would be washed away and he'd be forgiven. The more I turned that over in my mind, the more I felt out of place. This was a man who brought chains, eye hooks, and lubrication to a schoolhouse full of little girls. He lined them up, shot them, and then saved a bullet for himself. I couldn't bring myself to nod and say I forgave him because it made me a better Christian. Whenever the subject of preventing something like that from happening came up, locks, phones, anything practical, people would say, "It's in God's hands. We can't live in fear. The Almighty will protect us." I realized then that I didn't believe that in the way they did. Not anymore. It's been almost 10 years since I left nickel mines and the old order behind. Hey friends, thanks for sticking around and listening. If you want to know when new stories drop, make sure you hit that notification bell. I upload fresh narrations every Monday and Thursday at 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern, and we hang out on live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. Got your own story? Send it over to letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. You might just hear it in a future video. If you'd like to support what I do a little more, you can get early access to upcoming narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click the join button here on the channel to see the extra perks for members. You can also check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear these stories bundled into big compilations on pretty much any podcast platform. And if you're into true crime, take a look at my other channel, Saturn Soul. All the links are down in the description. Thanks again, friends. And remember, the Bigfoot creature Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin filmed on October 20th, 1967 was real. It was half man and half gorilla. Thousands of years ago, men went to Africa and other places and had sex with female gorillas and orangutans. That's why some Bigfoot have dark hair like gorillas, and some have reddish hair like orangutans. Some of the men who did that were tall, and some Bigfoot are tall too. Have you ever seen an 8-foot-tall gorilla or orangutan? Neither have I. When scientists found the bones, they thought we evolved from primates, but it wasn't a natural evolution. It was man-made evolution. Bigfoot can't save the earth, but we can stop overpopulating.